Hello, I'm your host Peter Sawchuk, a professor of adult education and workplace learning at the University of Toronto. You're listening to Work, Learning and Social Change, Foundational Voices, an informal discussion with some of the figures who have helped to define the field. In this episode, I'm speaking with Yrjo Engestrom, Professor Emeritus of Adult Education at the University of Helsinki, Finland. With work spanning almost 4 decades, he is known as one of the most defining voices of the cultural historical activity theory approach to work and learning. Hello and welcome to our audience out there. Our discussion series, if you've seen it before, is meant to be, pretty informal. But let me begin with a few prepared remarks, as I try to do, as way of introducing our guest. Yrjo Engestrom is the founder and director of the Center for Research on Activity Development and Learning, CRADLE, at the University of Helsinki. This is also the university where he completed his doctoral program in educational psychology in the 1980s, and from which his renowned book, my first introduction to him, Learning by Expanding, emerged. This is a publication that has, including its reissuing, has been cited an astounding 14,000 times, according to my count here. It's complemented by a virtual army of publications spanning more than 3 decades. He spent time cross-appointed in universities in North America, the University of California, San Diego. He holds honorary doctorate degrees from the University of Birmingham, as well as the University of Oslo. He's been a member of the Finnish Academy of Sciences for over a decade, I believe. And I could go on, but I'm not going to because we don't have enough tape in our video machine here. So, Yrjo, welcome. I'm just so absolutely pleased to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time. It's great to see you, and thanks for taking time to contribute to the discussion series. How are you? How are things for you?
I'm fine, thank you. As fine as one can be during this COVID era. Of course, the social isolation, it has some impact, but on the other hand, we get to network a lot more with people globally, and that's been in a way, it's been a great revelation how much we can actually reach out to one another and collaborate. So things are okay.
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing. Building skills and reaching out to people. Although time zone differences become zone difference negotiations and organization has become something that has become a big part of my life now with all this. Anyways. But let me jump right into my first question. It's a simple question in a way, but it could be very interesting. I want to ask you about your own impressions of your own work. Everybody reads your work. Many people read your work and have their impressions. But this is a kind of a unique informal space for you to give your own impressions about your approach as it's evolved really over decades. Its importance to the field of work, learning, and social change. What are its core problematics? What are its concerns, and what are its unique strengths, especially in comparison, in whatever way you'd like to think about it, to other, kind of current or popular or leading approaches that you understand in the field of work and learning. How would you speak to that question?
Yeah, I think that my own approach, cultural historical activity theory, and more specifically, the theory of expansive learning, they are rather, how to put it, demanding in the sense that they are built on a long history of cultural historical activity theory that started in what used to be Soviet Union with the work of Vygotsky, Leontiev, and Ilyenkov, Davidov, people whose name may not be very well known to a lot of younger scholars and students in what we call the West, but which I think would deserve to be read. So my work builds on that tradition. Basically, the very idea being that learning is something that actually should be understood as a creative process. as something that in which people go beyond what they can do now, which opens up possibilities for development and radical transformations. So learning is not just incremental accumulation or appropriation of existing knowledge and existing culture, but learning can be transformative in also a very radical sense. And that's why I call it expansive learning, the particular kind of learning that has been the focus of my own interest. And that idea stems very much from reading these Russian scholars, especially Davidov's work, who I was fortunate enough to also get to know him and to have some collaboration with him while he was still alive. Davidov, I think, was the first one who actually systematically and carefully built a theory of learning and a theory of instruction on the basis of dialectics. He was a student and collaborator of the philosopher Ilyenkov, who I think was the most creative and original among the Soviet philosophers, Marxist philosophers, and who also for that originality got into a lot of trouble in his life. But basically, this theory of Davidov's was based on the dialectical notion that learning can lead to genuinely theoretical understanding of the world. And by theoretical, he meant not abstract bookish knowledge, but something that is transformative, which goes to the roots of phenomena and to the foundational mechanisms and relationships behind complex phenomena. This idea in dialectical philosophy is called ascending from the abstract to the concrete, which means that this type of learning, which I call expansive learning, begins by looking for the sort of foundational basic germ cell behind some complex system that has given rise to that system. The most famous example being Karl Marx' Capital, in which he identifies the commodity as the foundational germ cell of capitalism. And commodity, it's everywhere. Anything, this pen here is a commodity. But what is important about it is that it's relation. It's a relation between use value and exchange value, which require one another and at the same time collide with one another. And this idea of commodity as a tension-laden relationship is very foundational. It's a powerful example of what this kind of germ cell can be. And if you can kind of build learning on first seeking and discovering a germ cell behind a complex system, and then building up on that, ascending to the concrete, you have something very, very powerful, which can transform the system, which can create and lead to creative new discoveries and new practices. I know that this sounds very complicated, and it is, but it's worth studying and worth engaging. And so when you ask about my own, how I see what my place or impact might be in the field of work-related learning, I think that it's very much an attempt to bring this dialectical tradition to a very practical settings, workplace settings, which are undergoing or facing major transformations.
Mhm.
And when there is a major transformation in a workplace, it's typically a situation where nobody knows exactly what the result will be, what the outcome will be. Of course, there are always people who think they know, but usually they're wrong. So this is a situation which calls for learning without a person or authority who knows what needs to be learned. In other words, it calls for learning something that is not yet there. It calls for learning which creates a new model for your own activity, while it also appropriates and tests and puts it into practice. In other words, it's a very different type of learning from what we usually see in, let's say, school settings or more familiar settings of learning.
I just want to open that key principle element there a little bit further, because there's a special relationship, if you've already summarized it really well, between a dialectical ontology, epistemology, methodology, and this theory of the human engaged in actualities of the real world, complex relations. But there's something about this, the real world, and it just reminded me of it when you started to say how people will have an account. For instance, the designers, just before we started our recording, we were talking about someone redesigning an office for my partner, and they don't know really what they're doing. But the difference here is that dialectics allow, or tell me if you feel this way too, dialectics allow an appreciation of complexity in motion. There's a famous phrase, right? And there's a world of difference between a static version of organizational life, or anything, however you want to conceive of it, and the hard path towards appreciating things in motion. And it seems to me to dovetail beautifully with the kind of the famous phrase, the learning what is not there, which many curricular-led, pedagogical-led learning doesn't do. Does any of that make sense to you in the context of your comments?
Absolutely. It is all about motion, like you said, that the very standpoint of dialectics is that world is in movement. And this means that instead of aiming at fixed categories and let's say the world of stable facts, of course you have to stabilize, but at the same time you have to build into your knowledge continuously the awareness of this motion, which means that you need to build what I call, rather than just stabilization knowledge, but you need to build possibility knowledge, ideas and knowledge that somehow open up the movement and make it clear that things can be different, that there is always a possibility to improve or change or transform the world. That's hard, and it requires, among other things, that you also are interested in the history, that you build your knowledge on how things have evolved. Where did we come from? How did this particular workplace look 10 years or 20 years ago, and what has happened after that? If we can build on understanding the historical evolution and transformation of a given practice or a given activity system, as I call it, then we're already in a good way toward expansive learning. So expansive learning must be built on a sense and understanding and careful scrutiny of the past history, because the past history opens up the possibilities of future.
Yeah, they define so much in it. The history is always not through with us. It's always happening, and
we're always making it.
And we're all and that. See, there's a lot of kind of secretly difficult steps if you take seriously that. It seems to me that an expansive learning approach demands to be taken seriously in this way. And so often many different traditions. I mean, in the social sciences or humanities in general, but in studies of work and learning, just slide over these kind of questions. And there's a demand. This is one of the reasons I've been attracted to the cultural historical activity tradition and your work, particularly because there's a demand that these are questions that demand a response in a way that a lot of other perspectives sometimes slide over. I want to ask you, it opened it up for me when you started talking about there's, I don't know if we want to talk about large capital T and small t transformations, but, I would say that, there's a form of a reproductive learning that isn't a repeat or a reproduction. It's different in a way, even though it has very little chance of creating change, but it is re-existing in a learning life in a different way, kind of, again, almost like, because I've always wondered about the fixation between, and even the definition of what transformation is in many theories of work and learning. But in yours, I'd ask you to speak about what the nature of transformation is and whether it can accommodate. An expansive learning perspective realizes and accommodates these kind of, creative, but ultimately reproductive or maybe even repressive kind of cycles happening as well at the same time. It takes that in. Is that part of the model?
That's a very good point and good challenge. And I'm glad that you took up the notion of cycles, because as I analyze expansive learning, I use the notion of cycles of expansive learning, which actually are made of expansive learning actions. The action of questioning the existing practice or the questioning the existing situation, the action of analyzing it, the action of modeling a new form of the practice, and the action of then examining and testing the model, the action of implementing the new model in practice, and the actions of consolidating it, reflecting on it and consolidating it. This type of cycles of expansive learning, they obviously, we can most commonly see them in a relatively large time scale. So for instance, when we conduct interventions, what I call formative interventions, typically with the help of the intervention method called the change laboratory, these may take several months or a year, even more, fostering and supporting a transformation effort in a workplace. But on the other hand, like you said, there's something going on at the same time, which is looks more repetitive, a small time scale. I give you an example. In recent years, my research group, we have been heavily involved in the transformation of home care in the city of Helsinki, home care for the elderly. The transforming itself from the sort of just giving the minimum routine services, nutrition, cleanliness, and medication. Going beyond that to pay attention to issues of physical mobility, memory, social isolation, issues like that, which are much more demanding, and they require that the sort of the object of this work is expanded beyond these routine tasks. Well, when that transformation goes on, still these practitioners, the home care practitioners, nurses, nurse practitioners, when they visit their clients, the elderly people in their homes, they still have to conduct these visits and do them efficiently within a certain time frame. Often they spend no more than half an hour in one home. And these are like small cycles that look very repetitive. But if at the same time you're involved and engaged in a sort of bigger transformation, the one like I just described you, going beyond the routine model to a more expanded model of home care work. These small cycles, there's these brief visits. And when you analyze them in detail, which is what we have been doing, videotaping these visits, you start realizing that these expansive elements are often embedded in what looks like very routine and very repetitive. So, don't be fooled by what looks like only more of the same. It may not be like that. Often these are subtle things, like, for instance, that the client, the elderly person, takes the initiative and says, hey, can we do some physical mobility exercises? Can you help me? And then it's a question of, will the practitioner go along or say, hey, I don't have time for that, sorry. And so on. So there's a recent article, actually a couple of years ago, in the Journal of the Learning Sciences, where I look together with a doctoral student who is now already a PhD, and Annalisa Sannino as the third author. We look at these very miniature cycles. But I think one challenge of this type of learning research is to connect between what looks small and repetitive and what is the bigger transformation, and how they inform in one another and how they feed one another, or how there might be a disconnect between them. So there's no automatic guarantee that while you're trying to generate a major transformation in a work setting or work organization, that the everyday repeated events are also transforming. It might be that there is huge resistance. Usually there is both. There's both local small transformation going on, and at the same time also a lot of resistance. And this is actually what is very interesting. That's where you sort of need to get engaged with these contradictory moves that happen there in the sort of smaller scale.
Well, this question, like so many, when I teach this, I teach it in several of my courses. At minimum, kind of at least in a 2-unit pairing, and students get very excited for a couple of reasons, but they often jump to the grand kind of contradictions of transformation, and and I think they find the people who go furthest with it find in this the slow and mini cycles, almost imperceptible if you don't have the right tools. Sure. That creates the the breaking of the wave. I mean, a wave takes a long time to come before you see that white water happen, and it just wouldn't exist with all that other activity, practice is going on way before it, maybe even almost a continent away, maybe. So I use those kind of things to kind of encourage people to find the almost the radical or revolutionary contributions of these sometimes very subtle operations, even, just something that they would write off as, that's technicist, you're fixated on technicist detail. Anyway, so it sounds like that fits a little bit with the with the demands of an expansive learning, and especially the intervention approach. It's all in the details. It sounds is it just on that, and you can respond to anything I've said. But what is the relationship between the work, the Change Lab, and expansive learning theorization? Are they just mere complements to each other? Are they synonymous to each other? How would you characterize that relationship?
Expansive learning goes on without us interventionists or researchers. It happens every now and then, and those are very interesting processes also to just even analyze after they have occurred. Any major transformation that leads to emancipation in human history, let's say the collapse of apartheid in South Africa, I think has been a major expansive learning process. Or cycles which they never are fully satisfactory, but they are important to understand. But then again, we should be able as researchers to influence and promote and support such processes. We are responsible as learning scientists, as educators and educational scientists. We are responsible not only to observe and record and explain, but also to actually intervene. And so besides, it's also important to point out that people intervene in each other's business all the time, whether we researchers want it or not. And we have even called it intraventions, when practitioners intervene in each other's work. So we should also recognize that that's going on. In other words, we don't have a monopoly of interventions as being the wise PhDs who come to the workplace, but we have our share to do, and we have our responsibility to intervene. So Change Laboratory is aimed at stepping in when there is a need and opportunity, both from the point of view of the practitioners and from the point of view of researchers, to actually facilitate, support, and enhance an expansive learning process. And so it doesn't claim that Change Laboratory does it. It's the practitioners who do it. But Change Laboratory might be a way to significantly make it more focused, more aligned, more collaborative, and in a sense also to give the practitioners a possibility to employ and use conceptual tools and instruments that stem from the traditional cultural historical activity theory, because an expansive learning process requires quite a bit of analysis and design. And, if you try to do it empty-handed, it's going to be very difficult. So there's a need for the researchers to offer something. We are not there only to analyze. On the other hand, a Change Laboratory has the benefit from the research point of view that it's being a relatively compact, typically, let's say, 6 to 12 sessions, which may take anything between, 3-4 months altogether, or might be a little longer or a little bit less, but it is still a reasonably compact process, which can be recorded, carefully videotaped, and analyzed. So it offers us also a kind of a more or less well-defined body of data to understand transformations and expansive learning processes. To talk about it as a laboratory is partly a little bit humorous, because our notion of laboratory being that it's the clean room where everything is under control, whereas in a Change Laboratory it is a place where you want things to get out of control. If everything happens as you as a researcher have planned, that's a failure. The learners, the practitioners need to take it over and deviate from your plans. And when that happens, you know that it's important.
Well, the unique space versus, I say, a boardroom in a existing institution or organization, the Change Lab space, I guess one of the things that jump out is not just the kind of set of array of tools and supports that are available, not just the kind of capturing of attention and time and space in a place, which is, it's like anytime you do a retreat or a residential experience, it has a powerful effect and focuses attention. But it's the multi-voicedness nature of the Change Lab that is one of the things that distinguishes it so much from the rest of work life. That different voices are and standpoints are co-present in a way that, yes, by the nature of the division of labor in society and organizations, they aren't.
Yeah, this is very critical. And that it offers, in a way, quote unquote safe context for these perspectives also to clash.
Yeah.
And in fact, by bringing in what we call mirror data, materials collected before the Change Lab sessions begin, ethnographic data typically looking for troubles and conflicts in the work setting, and bringing in them, in the form of video clips or other evidence, is supposed to actually prompt and stimulate these kinds of that the different perspectives become articulated and have to actually confront one another, so as to get to the roots of the trouble, rather than just find quick fixes.
Mm-hmm.
So it is. By the way, you said boardroom. The first change laboratory that was conducted in 1995 happened in post offices with the postal workers, and typical place was the dressing room, not the boardroom.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, the famous first that gave birth, maybe, I'm not sure, to Cradle, not originally named that, I understand.
No, it was still, at that time, it was called the Center for Activity Theory and Developmental Work Research. It was a little long name.
Yeah.
So Cradle is easier to remember.
No, Cradle's nice. It's where things get, help grow. Before, I want to ask you about plans for the future in a moment, because we're moving along here. But you mentioned the idea of searching for troubles and as a stimulation, and it's, since it's such a I find in teaching this type of work, the idea of double stimulation is one of the quick ways that people plug into actually the enormous complexity that's available in a kind of a complex but a very accessible concept or dynamic. Mm-hmm. And so just before I ask you about your future, can you say a little bit more about double stimulation?
Sure. Yeah, that's a key part of the heritage from cultural historical activity theory. Actually, this is a concept that comes from Vygotsky's work and often be misunderstood. The common misunderstanding, or let's say simplification of it, has been that, it just means that you offer a learner some tool or instrument that helps him or her to solve a problem. But the double stimulation is essentially about the formation of agency, about the formation of volitional action to break out a conflict of motives. Vygotsky's own example being that, let's say, for example, that you need to wake up early in the morning and you know that you would like to sleep longer. There's a little conflict of motives there. What do? You use an alarm clock as the second stimulus. And when you set the alarm, it might happen that you wake up 2 minutes before, even before the alarm rings, because you have actually created in your mind a second stimulus, which you have internalized, and you kind of you control your own actions by means of external artifacts. In other words, you empower yourself to break out a conflict of motives. And this is the idea of double stimulation. It is that when we face conflictual, contradictory demands and situations, which is typical in workplaces undergoing transformations. Take the home care workers. They being in the conflict that on the one hand, I'm told to be very efficient and stick to the timetable and not spend more than 20 minutes with one client. And on the other hand, I'm also realizing that the clients need more than this sort of minimal routine services. They need to talk about the loneliness or their physical mobility or their memory loss. And these are issues which you can't handle just by means of routines. You actually have to engage. And you can't do them for the client. You have to work with the client. So this type of conflict of motives is difficult. And in order to break out of it, you need something that might be called a second stimulus or auxiliary stimulus, as Vygotsky called it. And it can be something very simple. It can be, for instance, in the case of a client like that, it can be that you realize that you can start, for instance, doing little things together with the client. One example in our study was that a home care worker realized that the client had not emptied the trash, and the client was kind of partially immobile. And the issue was, who empties the trash? Is it the worker when the worker comes, or is it the client, or who? And so the worker suggests, let's empty it together. And we do it a few times together, and then you try to do it on your own. So this trash bag was the second stimulus. It looks like it's perfectly kind of mundane and insignificant, but it can become a hugely important, just like basically a little key to open the door to something new. In this case, it opened the door toward mobility, physical mobility. So the point is here that in double stimulation, we use very mundane, simple things, often opportunistically, what happens to work, what gains traction. Sometimes more systematically, we also offer what, in this particular home care case, what is called a mobility agreement. In other words, we make together a little plan. Let's do this and these exercises and follow up on how you're developing on them and so on, and jointly monitor your progress. Then that's a kind of a more deliberate second stimulus. But you can't trust that it will be working alone. It has to be anchored in the everyday realities of the given person's life context. And it might be that one client says, by the way, what I do is when I set the table for eating, I forget a fork. So I have to stand up again and go and pick it up. And so I purposefully forget something. In other words, I need to make an extra trip to the kitchen and back. So this is my second stimulus. It can be like that. It looks ridiculously simple, but at the bottom of it, it's an issue of overcoming, in this case, the fear of falling because you feel that you're becoming immobile. And on the other hand, the realization that if I don't move, I will definitely become immobile. So this is a conflict of motives, but you have to, gain some power to overcome it and to expand beyond it. And that power often comes from the utilization of small artifacts.
Almost devoid of meaning, separate from their use. Like a piece of string is the classic, all that stuff.
Yeah,
but
sure.
It's fascinating. People transform the conditions of their own adaptation, and that's a kind of type of agency, not a type that is, I don't know, it would be a bigger discussion.
I call it transformative agency because, there's all kinds of theories of agency which say that anything you do is agency, but this is agency which is transformative because it changes your life and it may change the life, also it may actually impact society around you. It may change the work of the home care practitioner because the home care practitioner becomes a learner in this situation. It's not just the client you're trying to teach the client. To the contrary, it's often that the client teaches the worker.
People used to talk about training a new pet, a dog, say, is really, it's not about training the dog at all. It's about training the owner. I'm conscious of your generous donation of time here. I want to go on to my second main question here, which is I've been really enjoying the conversation, but it's the future of the of your approach of expansive learning at minimum, but even other things. And I guess I'll sharpen it a little bit further by saying, what concepts do you suspect will emerge from the expansive learning tradition or from the chat tradition, what concepts maybe you could talk about the future in general as you see it for the approach, but then I guess I want to add that question about what concepts do you imagine kind of moving center stage as the approach evolves and expands probably. Any concepts?
Well, recently we've been writing about different generations of this approach, the cultural historical activity theory, and moving from, first focusing on actions, then moving to collective activity systems, then partnerships or combinations of two or more activities. And now increasingly, I think we need to look at quite complex coalitions, heterogeneous coalitions, which are involved with critical societal challenges. A big one, of course, would be the climate change or poverty or homelessness. So issues which require many workplaces, many organizations, many actors, many activity systems that have to find ways to align and orchestrate their efforts to somehow at least tackle these challenges and not just wait for the next catastrophe. And this fourth generation of activity theory, I think, calls for a number of new concepts. One is this idea of heterogeneous coalition or heterogeneous work coalition, which means that we need to look at the example being our recent work, especially done by Annalisa Sannino on the eradication of homelessness here in Finland, where change laboratories were conducted at multiple levels. At the level of a single supported housing unit for homeless youngsters, at the level of an entire city, different actors there who are dealing with homelessness, and finally also at the level of the entire nation, multiple ministries, multiple leading NGOs, key cities coming together to try to design the next phase in the strategy to tackle homelessness. So this type of challenge where the work that is deeply rooted in the ground level, in the frontline work, also must extend its influence to the level of policy making and how these changes can actually make an impact that goes beyond the local. This is a big challenge, and I don't think there is any easy solution or recipe how to handle it, but this is I think what we need to work with. At the same time, as you already indicated at the beginning of this interview, that you also have to ground it even more carefully at the minute small events. So you have to expand and extend to both directions, and that's very demanding, but I think that is necessary. So when we talk about the fourth generation of this theory, it actually means also rethinking the interventions. For instance, the change laboratories, as some change laboratories obviously need to be very heterogeneous. How do you deal with the radical diversity if you have, for instance, 10 different organizations represented in a change laboratory? You can't just start studying the history of one of them. You have to somehow build a history that unifies them, or at least brings them to the same page of debate. And these are challenges which are quite, they are, I think, pressing, because we are, we all know that in this day and age, we can't afford to ignore the multiple crises humanity is facing at the moment. It's not just the climate; it's interconnected with huge issues of poverty, inequality, and also issues of of politics that we see how the world is kind of falling apart. And you know, at least what we need to do is somehow get engaged in building viable alternatives. You know, I would say alternatives to capitalism. They might be in many ways limited, but we know that they already exist. There are all kinds of forms of human activity and human labor, human work, which involve alternatives to capitalism. And you know, not only in our own societies where we see, for instance, some progressive cooperatives, but very importantly also in the global South. You know, the landless workers movement in Brazil is a very good example, because it has been able to construct entire communities and their ways of livelihood based on common ownership and equality and democratic participation. So as I see it, the challenge to this approach is now increasingly in you know, developing what Anna Sanin calls enacted utopias. Utopias which are not just you know, visions, but are actually enacted. Eric Olin Wright wrote about real utopias, and very important analysis of examples of already existing alternatives to capitalism. But I think he did not get into how they are made. You know, he didn't study them in the making. That's our task. We have to get involved.
Yeah, there is a question of overcoming certain disciplinary relations. Like, I would never not want a historian, a trained historiographer, to learn from. But at the same time, that is not a learning science of any description. And yet, and the worst part of that sometimes is the fact that the excellent historiographer doesn't know that he's or she or they are not a learning scientist. It is a challenge for discussion. But this question, and Sandino on this question of heterogeneous, these very complex networks, and taking a methodology to scale like that is practically as well as theoretically challenging. And I associate with too, it's been around for a little bit, but the pursuit of the runaway object, maybe. You know, this question, and the larger this object, I'm not sure how merely metaphorical or conceptual that term is, but the pursuit of that requires ever larger forms of collective agency. The larger the thing you're pursuing, the thing you have to be larger, more collective and organized in that sense. You can say a little bit about that if you want, but I do want to end with a question I want to ask all. This is the Foundational Voices series. We have a new researcher series, and this is a Foundational Voice series. So in this series, I especially want to end with the idea of having an old hand, someone who's been around the block a few times, providing advice to new researchers, either new researchers, just you know, brand new doctoral graduates, or research even new to the field. You can leave that little commentary I just made to jump right to that if you wish, or it's up to you. But advice to new researchers is one of the things I want to close with.
Very quick commentary before I answer your last question is that you correctly point out that what is needed is to step into larger contexts, policy making, etc. On the other hand, we also need to pulsate. We need to keep our feet on the ground. We need to be rooted in local frontline work settings. And their clients, or their however you want to call them, whether they are patients or clients or students or whatever, but basically keep it local, rooted in where the work is actually done, but at the same time move outward, find the coalition partners. So it's a pulsation back and forth in some sense. I think that we need to start thinking of this type of research as a pulsating movement rather than just one-way movement, expanding and expanding. That's hard, but that's how I see it at the moment. As to advice for younger colleagues, I'm not in the position of giving advice to anybody, but since you give me this opportunity to play the role of the wise guy, my feeling would be that the first thing is that join forces, find others with whom you can work. These research challenges are not solvable or manageable alone. And the forces should not be only other academics or other students or other PhD candidates. It should be also people outside the academia. Join forces with social movements, with activity systems and people who are engaged in something which is worthwhile, which generates meaningful use values, which are necessary for our good lives and for the common good. Look for coalitions that build on the common good. And so that's my first advice, because I've seen so many young researchers suffer from isolation, not only because of COVID, but isolation because simply so many of young researchers from around the world, they contact and say, I don't have anybody to support me or to give me guidance in my university. What can I do? Well, I think that the first thing to do is indeed to contact people, but don't send a message just to me, but send it to 50 others too. And, start building various types of coalitions or support networks and collaborating. In order to collaborate, you can't just ask, you also have to give. So, but then the other advice, if you want, is that at the moment we live in an age which pressures young researchers to go for rather quick publications, quick studies, and this is dangerous. Powerful ideas have histories, and it's very important that you go to the roots rather than just pick the berries from the surface. Because if you just touch the surface and use something which looks fashionable and fun, very soon it becomes obsolete, because the generative force comes only if you go to the roots. And this is more laborious, but it's really worth the investment. So my recommendation is that while you join forces also with very active forces outside the academia, at the same time dig deeper and find the sources, the roots of the ideas with which you're working.
You never go wrong with either of those, although it's extra work. So the great thing about hard work is that you can always do it, Anyways, yeah, it is one of the few things that's close enough to, your own chance of doing things. I want to end us, bring this to an end, because it's been a very meaty, long interview. I've learned a lot. I want to thank you sincerely for doing this, taking time out. I think it's your supper hour, possibly. And I'm just waking up here, so I'm not completely with it. But I think it's important. People can read and have read your work extensively. It's also important for them to see you speak directly to it. And that's one of the things that our series is meant to do. I really appreciate it. It's just great seeing your face again. And I look forward to speaking again sometime soon. And I'll say goodbye.
Absolutely. Oh, by the way, my recommendation to everybody is use the conference, the RWL, Researching, Work and Learning, as it's a good venue to develop and nourish these ideas together with others. That's a site I strongly recommend. So just as a final remark, and it's one of the reasons why we are now together here. It's been one of those venues that brought us together many years ago.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's true. It goes to one of your first points of wise man advice. Okay, so I'll say goodbye.
Okay, keep safe, and thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, cheers. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.